Hello travelers, and welcome back to another first impressions video, this time for the March 2026 releases. There is quite a few things coming out this month, so we're going to jump right in. But first, to remind you, if you do end up enjoying this video or you're enjoying the other videos on the channel, please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps it out. And if you do feel like you want to support the channel financially, there is, as always, a link to a Buy Me a Coffee in the description below. It's not necessary by any means, but it is always very much appreciated. Or if you are buying anything from the Corvus Belly store directly, there is an affiliate link in the YouTube description that if you use it, it helps support the channel. But with that, let's jump into the crazy month of models that we're getting in March. Beginning with the Scions of Yaldabaoth, we will get to look at Gitmalu, the perfect one, with her creepy, not quite slug, creepy, I don't know, her weird cape. It's creepy cape, stepping on some tinge. That was the concept. Here is the actual model. Interestingly, she is not the classic red skin of most Scion elves. She's kind of this kind of gray color, although the art on the box actually has her more of what I'd say a standard elf skin tone. And we get her in her laboratory. But let's quickly look at her card and give my first impressions. Now, this is first impressions. Things will definitely change. We haven't had much time to look at these, and especially with things like this, I expect combos to come out. So looking at her card, she comes in at a nice 25 points. She's pretty good value for what you get. She is a caster. She's only 2 wounds. She brings a command token. And, in classic elf fashion, she's pretty fast. Now, she isn't very durable with only 2 health and 2 morale, but we will see that she has the potential to actually be fairly durable, in part because of her elite, which also helps with her offensive output, which again is kind of contingent on who it is you're facing. And the reason for that is her only form of attack. We see her melee and defense stats are just dashes. Her only form of attack is through her spell Unique, which allows you to target an enemy unit within 18 strides. If you spend 2 tinge, you can choose an additional target. 18 strides, really nice range. I like my squishy casters to be able to stay as far back from enemies, and most enemies can't threaten you if you're within 18, which again is quite nice. And what you do is you resolve a ranged attack, and when you do, you use one of the unit that you're attacking's attack values. You do not apply effects that modify the attack's value. So what does this actually mean? So from what we can tell, and based on other rules and discussions, attack value or defense value isn't like when it says use the attack or defense roll. In those cases, it's just the dice. When it says attack value, it actually means everything to do with the attack, including any bonuses from attached characters. So this means that you get the dice from the attack, you get the switches from the attack, and we're pretty sure you also get the stress modifiers. Now, for the attacks for her spell, we're still waiting for clarification on whether the stress modifiers count as an effect that modifies the attack value. We're pretty sure that it does not. And what that's referring to is things like in Northern Tribes, where the Prime Warrior adds yellow dice as her unit gets stressed. That would not be captured by... Gitmalu wouldn't get those extra dice for being stressed, but she would get, whatever bonuses the Prime Warrior gives to her unit as well as their dice. So this is potentially very strong. The harder hitting your opponent is, the harder it's going to hit. And because she's elite, she's actually going to be able to use their attack better than them. She has this handy ability where she can walk away from combat without provoking attacks of opportunity. With 2 wounds, you don't want to be engaged, especially when the only way she can attack is with ranged attacks through the spell. So it is nice if she survives the 2 wounds. And the way she might actually survive is thanks to Unreachable, which is kind of like her spell, it gives her the ability to target an ally or enemy and use their defense value. So it's the exact same thing. You get the full value, switches. This is where we know for sure that value includes switches, because the second line gives you an additional switch and says it's in addition. Besides the switches, you may use this switch. So essentially you get both. So it lets her get tinge. But really what you want to do is have her within line of sight of an enemy. There's no range on it. So as long as she can see, she can use it of an enemy or ally with a high defense die roll. And then, she can be very defensive. Again, with the elite. So she's counting all the hollows and things like that. So for example, let's say you make sure to have it so she can see a unit of echoes with a needle attached. Well, now suddenly she's rolling a green, 2 blue, and 2 black with the double special cancel a hit switch. So now she's getting pretty durable, just like those echoes. Now she wouldn't get the bonus blue die from a tutor that was near those echoes, but if the tutor was near her, she would. So she's going to be very interesting in how you use her to just like use different abilities, different characters' attacks against them. I do think that when you're thinking about activating her to attack, I think we really want to wait for her to have 2 tinge before you do, so that you can get the high value of being able to attack twice per spell. Now she does get 1 tinge a turn, and there's plenty of characters that can give extra tinge during your round, so you might still be able to do it, the first round, and then when she casts her spell, she can choose to gain a tinge to get an additional success. So once you do the spell once, you should be able to, do it at least once per round where you are doing the 2 attacks. Now, the most exciting thing for me on her card is actually her last ability, Exquisite. I personally think this is actually potentially the strongest ability in Warcrow, period, at this point. Now, it has no line of sight. It affects all your allies when they're contesting control of an objective. And what it does is, if you have the same total conquest as your opponent, you win control of the objective. Essentially, you win ties. And why is this so powerful? Well, one of the big things with Warcrow is whoever gets to an objective first, then your opponent usually needs to out-conquest you, which can be quite hard, right? Most things aren't getting above that 2 conquest amount. And normally, if I can take race to the objective, get to the objective first, have 2 conquests on it, it's going to take my opponent a lot more usually to put 3 or 4 conquests if I have 3 on it, right? With Gitmalu, if someone has 2 conquests, even she, with her 2 conquests, which is very high for a character, she could just walk onto it at the end of the game. And now, where your opponent would normally be, satisfied that they control it and that your opponent will need to put more into it, she's now making it so it's that much easier for you to just take back objectives. And as we say, scoring objectives is how we win games. And something that just makes it this much easier for you to take objectives from your opponent is very powerful. There's been some talk of it online. Some people, I think, are undervaluing how powerful it is. But I think as your opponents, Scion players, start realizing how strong it is, Gitmalu is going to be a prime target for assassination. But as I said, luckily, she is pretty defensive. One thing to keep in mind, her defensive ability does require line of sight. So if you're planning to use your Echo's defense, make sure that she has line of sight to them, and that if an opponent charges into her, they aren't able to wrap her and cut off line of sight. So that's Gitmalu. Moving on to the other one that uses the same model. This is the Lifted. This is kind of like the generic Gitmalu, although I say generic, they're kind of very different. They have some things in common in that they have this focus on wanting to have 2 tinge, but other than that, they're not very the same. One nice thing is the Lifted is yet another virtuoso. So that means that she, like the Puppeteer, like Mael, can raise those risen units, like the Husks, and as we'll talk about in a minute, the Aodhura. So I like having at least 2 units with Virtuoso if I'm leaning into those risen units, because that way if one dies or, if one is locked in combat and maxed on morale and has activated, I'm still able to have the second one, respawn the essential husks to keep alive the puppeteer and Mael. Now, the lifted doesn't have the ability to pass wounds to them and is much more vulnerable because of it, but she still has value in her own right. And one of those things, ability Scion players are familiar with, she has Black Rain, like the Breath and Samara, so this is another way to do a burst of Tinge. And she really wants Tinge, as would be expected of a Scion caster. She does have the Tinge ability, so she gets one a turn. But then both her spell and her passive ability really want her to have 2 Tinge. And the reason for this is quite simple. Her passive ability allows her to increase the range of her spell from 12 strides to 18 if she has 2 Tinge, which is very good. 12 is within the threat range of a lot of units in the game. 18 is outside of the threat range of most units in the game. And for a 3-wound model with not the best defenses, you really want to have yourself out of range of being attacked. So what does her spell actually do? So what her spell does is it allows you to target an enemy and make a ranged attack against them. Now, if you have 2 Tinge, you can target 2 different enemies within range and make the ranged attack against them. So you really want to have the 2 Tinge, like Gitmalu, before activating her to attack to get the most value out of the spell, so you're making 2 different attacks. Now, her attack isn't the most damaging. It's only red, orange, and 2 yellows, but that can chip some damage. She does have a switch when she does it as the spell to cancel a shield for the cost of a Tinge, which, you probably have the Tinge to spend at least one of, just to push a bit of damage through. But I think more importantly, her spell has this nice double special switch of shoving your opponent 5. Now, if you're 18 strides away, and you can get this double special, which on red, orange, and 2 yellows is pretty likely, you're getting to push your opponent further away, and this helps provide quite a great amount of control, getting opponents out of position, breaking up bubbles. Let's say you're going after an opponent's Mael, and there's only 1 husk unit near her, and you can shoot the husks first to push them 5, or if you get 4 specials, push them 5 and then 5 again. Now maybe you can shoot Mael and she doesn't have the protection of her husks. So this type of displacement and reliable displacement is very good. But yeah, you really do want her to be activating only with 2 Tinge, or she can activate to attack with 1 Tinge if you're in 18 of 2 units already, because she could activate, use her skill to give herself and allies near her Tinge, and then do her spell as her second action. But you'd never want to be in a position where you're casting that spell without 2 Tinge on you at the beginning of it. Okay, moving on, we have the actual support character box for the Scions, which includes Aodhura, that mass of appendages and ooze on the left there, and the Namaoin, which is kind of like the ambush. Well, it is the ambusher for the Scions. So here is what their regular release models look like. Both of these models are updates of the previous Warcrow adventures profiles that were put out as a bit of a placeholder. So look at them all hanging out together. And we start by looking at the Aodhura. This is right now on the screen the old unit profile with the 30-point cost, and here is the fancy new 25-point version. So it is cheaper, but it maintains a lot of its character. So it doesn't do as much damage, it doesn't survive quite as well, up front, but it does have a lot of the same character of kind of being a unit that's trying to really slam into the opponent and do a lot of stress damage. Now, we do note that it is risen, is golem and bloodlust, and keeps its intimidating too. So again, working on that, pushing up the stress of your opponent. It does only have an orange die, so there is a fair chance that it will be forced to charge, but it has a nice charge of 12. So effectively a threat of 14, and you just activate it if you want it to charge. Um, Looking quickly before we get into its attacks and things, we see its abilities. It does have both the returned and hinge golem abilities from the husks. So that means it just gets respawned by a virtuoso. So Mael, the puppeteer, or the lifted, just by spending a command token and a tinge. So very easy to respawn it. Much easier than before where it was only Master Nephrim that could do it, so that's great. And it has the Tinge Golem, so it can use Tinge to essentially counteract damage. Now, looking at its attack, we see it has a red, an orange, and 2 yellow, which isn't the best attack, but it has some handy switches. You can spend a Tinge, so if you don't want to use it for blocking damage, you can use the Tinge just to automatically give stress. You can gain Tinge with 2 specials, so you can both gain some back up and immediately spend it, or you can gain it so you can stay alive for any counterattack. And of course, if you get a hollow hit, you will get frightened, which, given that this unit, 1, can put out stress to help demoralize your opponent, and it has intimidating, playing with the frightened and making your opponent fail or do worse on, either the test to avoid fleeing or just the test against intimidating. It's always good to make it so they have to reroll dice. In defense, it's nothing special with just 2 blue and an orange. It's not, particularly tanky up front. It only has 3 wounds as opposed to its old 5. But with a single special, you gain a tinge. So as I said, you're balancing tinge for stress, doing stress your opponent and damage. But because you have that nice switch of just a single special is tinge, gains tinge, in defense, it kind of functions like a super block. Every special you get can essentially just become a damage negation, which is better than a block because it, will protect you from auto damage. If you already somehow do block all their attacks, now you just have an extra tinge for spending when you attack. So it's actually a very good switch. Now, you only have 3 wounds, and if your opponent, if you have no tinge on you and your opponent just does 3 auto damage through switches, you won't have a chance to build the tinge to block it, but that's a fairly rare situation. Realistically, this unit is really adding further to the Scions' stress manipulation game, another unit that's giving out stress outside of winning combat just from switches, plus intimidating, plus giving out frightens, really building on this Scion strategy of locking your opponent so that they can't really activate, and hopefully you have a bunch of guys running away. Now, it does have this interesting new version of Dimensional Flash, which essentially, instead of just auto making guys demoralize, it boosts how effective your attack is. Now, the 2 parts of it you're most likely to get are the having 1 or 2 stress on your opponent, giving you an extra hit, and then just a auto damage. Those are much more likely, in my opinion, than that if your opponent is frightened, you get an elite. Now, the reason I say that the elite part won't come up as much is because, let's say you attack and you put on the frightened. Your opponent, if you, push your opponent back, when they charge back in, they're going to take intimidating, which means the frightened is going to come off. If you don't push them back, you will have it on defense. If you get attacked first and you happen to get the hollow shield, you'll be able to put it on. But again, if you don't start engaged, the intimidating is likely going to strip the frightened off, so you probably won't be getting the elite very often. Moving on to the Namaoin. Again, here's the old profile, 30-point profile, and it dropped to 25, but in my mind, complete rework. The previous Namaoin had this weird ability to hide inside of a unit and do damage to them and nerf them. That was kind of weird and didn't really like how it worked, or he could jump out in like a normal ambusher and try and assassinate. The new Namaoin doesn't do that. He's a very unique ambusher in my mind in that his focus is very much on objective play rather than assassination. And this is very apparent when we look at his attack. He has 2 orange dice and 2 yellow. This is a very weak attack. This is the same attack as the breath, outside of the hollow hit being able to do an auto damage. The real big thing here is the goal is getting those specials to cause your opponent to suffer stress. And while that is, kind of nice for making people run, the bigger thing is how the stress plays into his abilities. And he has these 2 abilities. The first one targets all enemies, doesn't require line of sight when he is contesting an objective, and all your targets reduce their conquest value by the stress they have. So, for example, if Namaoin charges into a unit, puts 2 stress on them, either through switches or by, winning combat and switches, now that opponent, if let's say they were 2 conquest, now they're 0 conquest, and the Namaoin will win that objective with their 1 conquest. So, he's really good at jumping in as a last activation, attacking an enemy. Let's say there's, your opponent has a single unit on an objective. Even if they're in a position where you can't push them off the objective for whatever reason, he can just jump in, do enough stress to them that their conquest drops to be, 0, so that then he steals the objective. This is particularly powerful when partnered with Gitmalu, like we talked about before, where, you win ties. So now Namaoin will only need to get your opponent's conquest on the objective down to 1, and then he'll be able to take it instead of needing to get it all the way down to 0. Now, he is very squishy. He doesn't have a particularly strong block with just 2 blue and a black. He does only have 2 wounds. But if you are able to put a bunch of stress on anyone that is going to attack him, he does have the second ability that forces your opponent to make a whip test when they attack you. So, again, could give them even more stress. They need 2 successes, and for everything less than 2, they gain a stress. It's kind of like intimidating, but it doesn't require engagement. It's just anytime you're attacked. And then you get to add a auto block for each stress on your opponent. So let's say you have an opponent, you jump in, you put them up to 2 stress, and they activate and attack you. If they completely whiff the roll, maybe they're up to 4 stress now, they're going to likely demoralize at the end of the activation, and you're adding 4 blocks. Now suddenly the Namaoin might not die. So I don't think it makes him particularly tanky, but it might help him when, if you're charging into just one enemy. Like, let's say there's a bucklerman holding an objective, he charges in, probably going to put some stress onto them, maybe not get any damage through, so they're not getting pushed back. You'll win over them because you'll knock their conquest down to 1 or 0. Now you're winning. If they decide to try and hit you back, now, they're bad whip, they're probably going to fail at least getting another whip, getting another stress. So now you're getting 3 auto blocks, and now you actually have a pretty good chance of not dying. So those are the 4 Scion profiles that we got with the 3 models. Moving on to Feudom. So the first Feudom model that we're getting in March is the Instructor. So this is the solo model that comes in a solo box. Big lady wielding a big mace. As we will see, that freehand on that shield, I assume its freehand is just amazing. I'm glad I don't need to paint Feudom right now because I could not do anything close to that. But getting into the profile and our first impressions of her. So we'll note of the releases in this support month for Scions and Feudom, she is not actually support. She is an officer. She is also the only one that can attach. We are seeing this trend now where supports don't seem to get the ability to attach. None of the support models released this month for Scions or Feudom can attach. None of the supports released for CNN could attach. We haven't actually seen, the most recent supports that could attach were in the Song of the Dormant, but really we're actually seeing this trend where it's actually more supports, I believe now, that don't attach than do attach. But Instructor's not a support, she's an officer, so we're going to see her joining any Feudom infantry. She is a noble, she's a priestess. She has, I'd say, a pretty solid unattached form. She has decent hit. She actually can be quite defensive with that nice hollow shield, hollow shield switch for canceling 2 hits, 1 conquest. But I don't think you're going to actually see her unattached. You're going to want to play her attached, and since she's an officer, if your unit dies, then you at least have a decent unattached officer to run around afterwards. The 1 passive ability she has while unattached, she still has 1 attached, so you're really not missing out on anything. Now, when attached, she actually brings some solid buffs to her unit. She gives an extra whip, which is always nice, an extra morale, so again, staying in the fight longer, not demoralizing. She gives a conquest, scoring points is how we win, so always good. And then she gives an auto hit into melee and a blue dice in defense. So you're kind of buffing every single stat you care about. She doesn't bring wounds because she's not a Scions, but otherwise you're buffing every stat, which is always nice for the low cost of 25 points and with a command token. She has 3 abilities. The first is a command token ability that once per activation, you can spend a command token. You get to add a whip die to your attack. So essentially, at the very least, a yellow die, but most things that she'll probably be in will have an orange die in their whip. So essentially, she's now adding a hit and an orange die, and you get to be elite for the next attack roll. So this is when you really want to turn up the damage. You just spend a command token to really boost the damage on one big attack, which is actually quite good. This game, you don't make that many attacks outside of additional, special ways of getting extra actions and extra activations. You only get 15 activations, and most units aren't going to be hitting more than a few times in a game. So being able to have once per activation and a few times in a game just really boost up the damage of a single unit is quite good. Then she has this really cool passive called Move by Faith that targets all allied units and resolves at the end of the activation of an allied unit. And what it does is, if one of your many casters targets a unit, at the end of the caster's activation, any units that were successfully targeted by a spell, so the cast has to go off and they need to be targeted, gets to just displace 3. So that's pretty cool when you're buffing your various units, and we've seen a number of different of these priestesses that buff units, they get to displace. Now, as we'll see, some of them displace themselves because they're the targets and they kind of an aura. Others, we're still waiting, might target multiple guys. If you can ever target multiple friendlies with a spell, this, the Instructor becomes even much more valuable because you're getting that many more displacements. But extra movement is always good, so it's a pretty cool ability. And then she has this Experts in Combating the Fog ability that now when her unit attacks or is the target of an attack from a golem, large tinge, or spellcaster, you can cancel a hit and a block from the enemy. This also applies if the enemy has tinge, which I'm not sure will come up for anything that wouldn't be already covered by Golem, Large, Tinge, or Spellcaster outside of the elf in Seonin that has... No, he has the Tinge ability. So, I guess the only way this would come up is if you're playing the Rift, which is the feat where there are Rift markers where units gain Tinge being near them. Outside of it, really the keywords are what you need to focus on. But I guess if you're playing the Instructor in Rift, keep in mind that, you're going to have fun with her in there because she'll be able to be getting these buffs against anyone that's ending their activations near the Rifts. But really, this just, to me, just screams anti-Scion specialist because there's so many Scions that are either golems or casters or have the tinge ability or are going to be caught in Scion bubbles giving out more tinge. So she's really good if your regular opponents play Scions, but otherwise solid buffs, great for boosting your knights. Now moving into the Feudom support box, beautiful models. I love the Falconer. He's just such a cool model. That blue cloak looks great. As people have pointed out, there is a little bit of meat on his belt because you got to feed the falcon. And then we have the priestess. Looking first at her, specifically, this is Armelle of Northsby, which is the named priestess. We do get a named and unnamed version in the box. And she comes in at 25 points. She is a spellcaster. Realistically, her profile to me is not very exciting above the abilities and spells that she has. But quickly just looking at things, she has a good whip with a red and a yellow, very reliable for casting. She is noble, which is always handy with Feudom, especially because Guizarmier are so good and she just boosts then their conquest. Her attack is nothing special, red to orange. Hollow specials add hits. You can give disarmed very easily. But otherwise, you're probably not really getting much damage. Her defense isn't really anything too special either. She can stress to get 2 extra blacks, which help with, If you are getting attacked and you don't want her to die, it's probably worth it because you do have a better chance then of getting those hollow shields, which adding 2 blocks. If you can get it, if you happen to get the hollow block, it is very good. But otherwise, again, nothing too exciting. She does have 3 wounds, which is pretty good for a support caster, so she might hang around. But really what you're here for are the 2 spells. Now, she has 2 different buffing spells. You have the first one, Shield of the Moon Goddess, that gives your guys elite in their defense rolls, gives them a dispel, and you can ignore the first damage suffered per activation this last 4 rounds, so that's pretty good. So that's your defensive spell. Now, as I said, this targets her, and then affects guys within 7 of her. So if you have the Instructor, it will be her that's displacing at the end of the activation. And then the second spell is the Enchanted Weapons, but this is the offensive one. So rather than buffing your guys' defenses, now guys within 7 of her are immune to Disarmed and Vulnerable. So kind of helps her defensively because they can't be vulnerable, but no Disarmed, no Vulnerable. And then, with the boosts, you can make them elite for their attack, which is very good. Elite's a very powerful keyword. And you can have them get the ability to reroll 2 dice from their attack rolls. So I think realistically, if you're doing any of these buff spells ever, you want to be pushing them to their full augments, because they're only going to last 4 rounds. You're spending an activation on just buffing up. You want to make it as impactful as possible. She does have this nice passive ability that allows her to cast a spell when she declares a charge or assault, which is nice. It helps with action compression. A lot of the time it's hard to do these buffing spells because usually you're doing a buffing spell and maybe standing somewhere. You're not progressing the damage. You're not displacing your opponents. So being able to run in, punch somebody, do this spell is nice. It synergizes quite well with some of the Feudom abilities on some of their high commands that allow you to chain activations. So with the Magister, because she's a noble, she can charge into somebody, cast a spell, and then chain activate to have a Guisarme that's nearby, maybe charge the same unit. And now the Guisarme get the benefits of ganging up on that opponent. And they're already disarmed, but if you, for example, do the offensive, the Enchanted Weapons, now they charge in, now they're nearby, now those Guisarme are elite and get to reroll 2 of their attack dice. So I think there's some cool combos there. Definitely will be interesting. Keeping tracks of the spell durations will definitely be something you'll need to pull out those markers for the wheel that I know I haven't really used too much. Now we get the generic version of her, which is the Priestess of Selas. She's 5 points cheaper. She doesn't have the nice cast on a charge. She still has the noble, so that's always good. And she has 2 different buffing spells. So again, these priestesses, they're just buffing you up. They're not doing offense on the opponent. But her, when she buffs, it will be just a buff. She doesn't get to do that charge that we were talking about with the named version. So her 2 different buffing spells are different. So one is defensive focused, and one is how I describe a support function. So the first one, you target an allied unit within 12. So this is just targeting one ally. Same for duration. It allows them to fix a defense die in their roll. Very powerful. Takes out the randomness. You can set a die to be exactly what you need. Maybe that's, a block and a special is a common one, because then if you have a good switch on the special, you're guaranteeing it. Or maybe if this is somebody that has something like a hollow block equals 2 defense, or 2 blocks, now you can just set it to that more rare face. You can buff this spell to make it so, depending on what the attacker rolls, your defender gets to add hits to their defense, which is kind of neat. Again, I usually think that if you're doing a buffing spell, you might as well push it to its max. So you might as well do both of these. Her second ability, as I said, is a support spell. It's a bit confusing. We're waiting for clarification. It says target unallied units. So it has both singular and plural. Most of the spell refers to target. The rest of the spell, though, does refer to target. So my guess is it is only targeting a single unit within 12. If this targets all allies, it's very powerful. And it's a support function. What it lets you do is you remove one state, effect, or tinge token, or you can reduce a stress. That's the base ability. Now, if you're targeting somebody that has multiple of those things, you can boost it to remove a second one, or if you chose stress the first time, one in the first place, or you can have it, for 2, reduce stress. So at max, you could have this reduce a stress, remove a state, effect, or tinge, and then remove another of either state, effect, of tinge, or stress. Now, this is one of the very few things in the game that allows you to remove tinge, which is pretty good, and we're seeing more and more tinge play from Scions. So if you run into Scions a lot, again, maybe you got to Purify. So it also has stress reduction, which stress management is a big part of the game. So having a guy that can just say, actually, no, important unit, you don't need to worry about resting. Maybe you're engaged and you can't. Do you want take 2 stress off, or take a stress and that disarmed and a negative spell that's faced on you? That would be, I think, what an effect token would be. So very cool. I don't have enough experience definitely playing it yet. I think it'll be interesting to watch Feudom players experiment with it. The timing and knowing when to buff and when it's too early, when it's too late, is, I think, a really tricky thing that will reward players that really practice with it. Moving on to the model that I like the most in this set, and that is the Falconer. Okay, but let's look at the Falconer's profile. Now, he comes in at 15 points, which is just great for filling out lists. He's not going to be doing a lot. He's not going to be doing offense. He's very much there just in a support capacity. His attack is like red-orange. You don't want to attack with him. Ideally, he's not getting attacked himself because his defense isn't very good. He has preferred terrain rugged, so he can get into the terrain, which is nice, especially when coupled with Scout. I say it's nice because he's camouflaged as his second passive, which means if he's within 3 of terrain, opponents outside of 7 can't draw a line of sight to him, which makes it harder to shoot or charge him. You can still assault, but it just makes it in general harder to get to him. He then has 2 abilities. The second passive that he has, Tear Out Their Eyes, just says that anytime one of your units that is within 18 of him is doing a melee attack, the Falconer can take a stress, and then the person your guys are attacking count as being engaged by multiple combatants. So then they need to remove a die or a automatic symbol. So this, you won't be able to do it very often because he only has 1 morale. But hey, even if you can do it once per round, being able to just give your knights the edge in combat because your opponent needs to lose a die is really, really handy. And he can just do it for standing there, which is pretty awesome. His second ability, or the first on his card, is his skill. So this is something if you choose to activate him, which is very simple. You just target any enemy within 18 strides. I assume 18 strides is how far the bird can fly. And they just gain a stress and get any condition you want. Stress and conditions are great. It helps you win in these prolonged fights where your knights are battling out with somebody, and Feudom kind of likes some of these grinding fights because their knights are pretty durable. They like hanging around. And making it so your opponent has 1 more level of stress, that much closer to run away, that much closer to not be able to activate again. And any state is really good. So I think most likely you'll be looking at doing vulnerable if you're trying to punch through extra damage onto the opponent, or disarmed if you're just trying to keep your knights alive. And yeah, as I said, he has camouflage, which really just keeps him alive. Okay, it's been a long episode. Moving on to the final model for the month of March is the Seonin, and we finally get their large model, the Moss Hermit. Big, cool tree guy. Jokingly, this is also the 4th Feudom model of the month, because we have that great poor Feudom warrior wrapped up. Looks maybe like he's about to be chucked by the Moss Hermit. And of course, the friendly Raven has come by just to hang out on his leg. So, the Moss Hermit. Large model, 35 points, which is very reasonable for a large model. He has Nemoris, which is good. He gives you a new place to teleport to with the portal, which it means that if you're bringing Leoslaith, he has essentially damage reduction at all times. He is intimidating, very handy in preferred terrain forest. So he's a tree man. Of course, he can move through a forest. Okay. I really like the design of him. He is a very interesting design. He defensively is okay. His attack is okay in terms of output. But what he really does is a lot of control. Now, before we get into that, it's important to note that he is neither golem or manned, which means he can demoralize. But as we move down his card, we'll see that he doesn't really care about being demoralized. Kind of just jumping ahead, I guess, to Quick Beam. We're jumping around a bit. It's first impressions, kind of what I think is interesting. So Quick Beam essentially says that when he's demoralized, and this is permanent, so it's always in effect, when he's demoralized, he is considered a terrain element with the keywords of impassable and blocks line of sight. Essentially, when he gets demoralized, he just becomes a tree. He stops moving, he just becomes a tree. He cannot perform any kind of movement, and he cannot be placed, which means when he becomes demoralized, he doesn't flee, because that is a kind of movement. So if he does demoralize, instead of fleeing, he just stops there, stands there as a tree, and doesn't move. Which is pretty hilarious. It means, after 2 turns, he'll roll an orange die, and there's a 62.5% chance that he just wakes up again and stops being a tree. But until then, he is a tree that blocks line of sight, that you can't move through. But he is, still Nemoris, which means that your guys can still teleport to him. And he is terrain at that point, considered by the enemies. So there's some weird interactions. So, for example, if your opponent has camouflage, if they're standing near him when he demoralizes, well, now the enemy... sorry, I have it backwards. Your guys... the enemy needs to consider him terrain. So for the purposes of camouflage, if your units are near him when he is in terrain mode, now for your enemy's consideration, they're near terrain. Your guys are near terrain, so now you can't target them. So it's kind of weird. It's kind of silly. I kind of like it. There's the weird interaction with the engineer where technically when he becomes terrain, the engineer can put an explosive on him. It won't destroy him because CB recently updated the engineer that it doesn't remove impassable terrain. So I'd like to think that they knew this guy was coming and that's why they did it, but he can still have a bomb strapped to him that'll blow up on your guys that are nearby. But moving on to, I think, probably the more interesting part of him is all this kind of area denial and how good he is at displacing. So the 2 main things here is both in attack and defense. He has this switch of 2 specials. Displace is an enemy 3 strides. And that can be used on any enemy within 3 strides of him. It can be the person that he's attacking or defending against, or it can be another unit beside him. And he is large, so he can even push immovable, non-large models. So this means, let's say the Moss Hermit charges into a clump of enemies. Maybe, let's say there's Master Mael and a bunch of husks sitting on an objective, right? He charges into one of them, and let's say he gets 4 specials. He can choose with the specials to push away 2 of the units, the ones that he's not attacking. And then if he wins combat, push back the unit that he actually attacked. The other thing to note, it is displace, it's not shove, which means you can displace them in any direction you want. So you have a lot of control of where you're sending the enemies. So that's pretty good. He does get a bit more damage because of the hollow hit just doing auto damage. But that displace, I think, is the really cool thing. The other cool ability he has is for a command token. All enemy units within 3 strides suffer a stress. Just no roll, just straight suffer a stress. Now, right now, and as is worded on the screen, there is not a limit of once per activation on this ability, which means you can, if you want, blow all of your command tokens to just, let's say you have 4 command tokens, you can be like 4 command tokens, everyone within 3 of me gains 4 stress, and then probably have a good chance of running at the end of the activation. You can do really silly things with this. I'm calling the Moss Portal Gambit right now, at least until they, I hope, make this when he's added to Corvus Sphere once per activation. Right now, what you could do is use the Walker of the Leaf Storm, I believe his name, the portal elf, to first turn teleport the Moss Hermit. Have him coming in at the end of round 2. Or end of turn 2. At the end of turn 2, Moss Hermit comes in. You spend a command token, allowing him to charge into an enemy. Now, turn 2, most of your opponents models will probably still be in the deployment zone. Now, if let's say there's a nice clump, let's say there's like 3 units near each other, which early in the game can happen. So at the end of turn 2, Moss Hermit jumps in, charges one of those units. Ideally, the unit that has the highest morale. Now, hopefully wins that combat. Maybe you choose not to push it back. So now he's charged into a clump. One unit has a stress on it from losing combat. Then, before you end your activation, you just say, okay, I'm just going to spend, let's say 2 or 3 command tokens to give all those units, 2 or 3 stress. Whatever it is to get your opponents, all your units to 2 over their morale cap. Well then, let's say there was a clump of 3 guys. Now suddenly all 3 of those units need to test to demoralize. And because they're in the deployment zone, if they fail, they're just immediately running off the board. Now, it's a bit of eggs in basket. You're going to lose a lot of command tokens. It's not a fun thing. Don't do this to somebody. Hopefully it gets fixed before the Moss Hermit becomes, official in Corvus Sphere. Part of the reason I'm talking about this very abusing the rules type of thing is if we talk about it, then Corvus Belly hears and hopefully fixes it before it becomes something people actually start trying. But just know it is technically something, if you're playing around with this before it's added to Corvus Sphere, something you can do. And it is kind of funny. It would be one of those things. It's kind of funny to do once, but after that, less funny. His final ability is another cool kind of area denial thing, which is it targets all enemy units that are within 3 strides at the end of their activation. So essentially, if your enemy ends a unit's activation within 3 strides of him, they're going to need to make a defense roll. And if they don't get 2 specials, they become vulnerable. If they don't get a hollow shield, they just take a damage. So it's kind of just this, it's annoying to be near this guy, which is handy, right? And then you put him on objective, make it so your opponents don't want to come near him. Yeah. Now, I believe that does turn off when he is demoralized, because I believe you can't use any of your abilities that target. So that does require targeting. So you don't need to worry about it when he is just a tree. But when he is not demoralized, ending near him, you do, you risk, depending on how good your defense roll is, you're risking gaining an annoying state or just taking a damage. But those are my first impressions of the March releases. That was a lot. But, there is a lot coming out in this month. It is 9 new profiles, which is quite exciting, especially considering a lot of us didn't expect to see anything coming out in March because it's Adepticon. And usually that means, hopefully we're getting Mount Haven at Adepticon. So usually that would mean we wouldn't be getting anything for the other factions. But hey, March could be a very good month between all these cool profiles and maybe Mount Haven, but we will see. And if we do get information about that, you can be sure that I will be making a video to talk about it. But with that, hope you enjoyed this video. It was a long one. I can't wait to hear your thoughts on these units. And, once people start getting practice with them. But until then, may the dice be ever in your favor.